Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hi there, and welcome to episode 59 of TheKillFile. I'm happy you guys are back for another episode today. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First off, I will be dropping the bonus content this fall called the Hidden Files, where you can pay a few bucks a month and get a few more episodes from me, and these will be slightly different than our regularly scheduled programming. These will be circling somewhat around true crime at times, but with different categories like natural disasters, plane crashes, and maybe some famous mobster stories. If you have a true crime story you would like to be read on the podcast, email it over to thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com, and I will give it a read and try to compile some stories for an episode, but it may take some time to get these depending on how many stories I'm able to get together. I'm looking for anything from a hometown story, maybe something that happened to you when you were younger, and maybe it isn't as well known as like the bigger cases. Maybe your nephew was a clown with John Wayne Gacy. Maybe your friend robbed a gas station and told you the tale. Maybe your uncle worked for a crooked judge and he told you some stories. Anything that you feel you want to share, send them in. You can stay anonymous and feel free to change any names that you want for anonymity. Also, check out the website at TheKillFile.com. And while you're there, you can submit a case for me to cover, or you can check out the merch shop, where we have tons of true crime merch that you are sure to love, and we add more all the time. Lastly, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen, which is the best way to boost the podcast and let other people know to listen with us and join us on Mondays. Okay, that is it for today's business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to be talking about a man that I personally had never heard of until I stumbled across this case, and I found it interesting. This is the case of Jeremy Bryan Jones. Ever heard of him? Trigger warnings for today are going to be talks of rape, abuse, murder, and I'm going to throw in a separate trigger warning for fire on this one as well. Here we go. We are going to be headed over to Mobile County, Alabama in the year of 2004. For the small city of Chunchula, sorry if I butchered that, Alabama, where according to the U.S. Census today has a population of about 195 people, so you can imagine a tiny town. We are now heading into September of this year when Hurricane Ivan was headed toward the area and gaining strength as it went. According to the report created by Stacy Stewart for the National Hurricane Center, Ivan had come from a large-scale tropical wave that had initially come off the coast of Africa on August 31st. By the very next day, there was some hurricane action that I didn't quite understand happening to create this disaster, with the actual tropical depression starting by 6 p.m. on September 2nd. Fun fact for those of us who don't know, I did a little digging, and it turns out, according to the National Hurricane Center, that a tropical depression is sort of like the first step, and what forms first, which is the quote-unquote tropical cyclone, that starts with a maximum speed of 38 miles per hour or less. The next step would be a tropical storm, which is also a cyclone, and this has the winds between 39 miles an hour and 73 miles an hour. The next step up is a hurricane, and that's also a cyclone of any speed over 73 miles an hour, which is fucking terrifying. A major hurricane is when the cyclone gets up and sustains over 111 miles an hour, which could make it a category 3 through 5 on the wind scale, called the Saffir-Simpson. So, after the tropical depression formed, there was a track created on where it was believed to be headed and where it would hit. Just 12 hours after the tropical depression would turn into a tropical storm, and this was on September 3rd, 2004. Heading west, Ivan was still gaining strength, and by 6 a.m. on September 5th, it was a full-blown hurricane and headed west. At midnight that same evening, so technically this would now be like September 6th, Ivan would reach the first peak of its intensity around 115 knots, which is around 132 miles an hour, and this would make it the most southern major hurricane ever recorded, at least at the time. After weakening for about 24 hours, Ivan would regain its strength while the U.S. Air Force Reserve reconnaissance aircrafts were monitoring it. They noted the eye diameter, which I'm assuming means like the middle of the hurricane, was a whopping 10 miles across. So this storm was big. In fact, it was a Category 3, 4, and 5 at different times and was headed south of Jamaica and south of the Grand Cayman Island as it passed by there on September 12th. Ivan became a Category 5 hurricane as it came into the Gulf on September 14th and turned northwest, sustaining the Category 5 for 30 hours, which is apparently a really long time for this. Ivan slowed only a little as it became a Category 3 right before hitting the area of the Florida Panhandle and Alabama in the morning of September 16th. By September 17th, there would be 117 tornadoes spread across the eastern and southeastern United States over 2 days. So, needless to say, Hurricane Ivan was a big deal. Now, during the time of the hurricane, a mother and grandmother, 44-year-old Lisa Nichols, would hunker down with her family, which included her 2 daughters, Amber and Jennifer, and son-in-law, Todd, in a hotel for safety. The very next day, as the damage from the Hurricane Ivan was being assessed, and as it would turn out, many people, of course, didn't have power, Amber tried to convince her mother to come stay with herself and her husband Todd, since they did have power. However, Lisa was set on heading home. I was assuming probably to assess the damage, possible to her own property and to clean up anything that needed work, so she headed home. When Lisa made it home safely, she let her family know that she had made it all right, and it's later heard from many people living where the hurricane hit that there were debris and everything in the road, so you had to be cautious while you're driving, I'm sure. This would be the last time that anyone in her family would hear from Lisa. One of the sources used heavily in this case was an episode of the show called Floribama Murders, and this is on the Oxygen True Crime Network, titled Hiddenin in Chunchula. And during an interview, Amber would speak to the fact that not only was her mother her very best friend, but that Lisa and her daughter would talk multiple times a day, every day. When Amber hadn't heard from her mother later into that day, she and her husband kind of assumed that Lisa must be busy with her stuff that she might have going on or was possibly cleaning up any problems left behind from the hurricane, which totally makes sense. I can't imagine what it would be like to have to clean up the streets and homes and businesses and other things left by this big hurricane. The first twinge of concern would come the next day and into that evening when Amber realized that not only had she not been able to get a hold of her mother, but that her sister Jennifer and her aunt hadn't talked to her either. This is when something started to feel off for Amber and her family. Lisa lived about an hour away from Amber and her husband, and it was said that later into that evening, Jennifer, Amber, and Todd piled into a vehicle and headed out to Lisa's home to check on her and to see what was going on. When they arrived at Lisa's home, they all grabbed flashlights and started heading into Lisa's home because there must not have been power. Amber would speak to the fact that when they first opened the door to their mother's home, they were smacked in the face with the smell of smoke coming from the trailer home. As they were entering the home, Todd, the son-in-law, would be the one who took lead into the house. While he was being interviewed on the episode of Floribama Murders, he was getting choked up and was in tears, as he would say that he was very thankful that both of the women didn't have to see what he saw as they were searching. He would call this one of the worst days of his life. As they were carefully walking through the dark home, Todd was able to, at some point, peek into the bathroom, where he would then immediately turn around and grab Jennifer, and this is when he would tell Jennifer, quote, "It's too late. Y'all call for help," end quote. Amber then said they ran out of the house screaming for help. She would further say the cell phone towers were down, so they couldn't call 911 right then and there, and because of that, they had to run to neighbors' homes, and they ended up at a man's home named Mark Bentley. When Mark answered the door, all that Jennifer was able to get out of her mouth was that her mother needed help. Now, inside of Mark's home, besides his family at the current time, was, at least in the living room area, were 3 men. Mark, a man named Scooter, and another man whom was unknown, but both of the other men were staying with Mark and working for him as they were cleaning up the hurricane debris and making repairs. When Jennifer said her mother needed help, Mark, who had always been a neighbor that had kept an eye out for Lisa because she was a single woman living alone, him and Scooter ran out of the door right behind Jennifer to come and help at Lisa's home. The third man stayed behind and didn't offer to help at all. One of the other reasons that Jennifer came to the neighbors was, I believe, to see if maybe they had a landline to call 911 because they didn't have cell service. It wasn't exactly made clear how, but somehow and thankfully, the authorities were called that evening. When the authorities were able to come to the trailer, they, along with the family, would agree that as they carefully had taken a look around the place, since there was no lighting and since Lisa, unfortunately, seemed to already be gone, they all decided to leave the scene until the morning so that they wouldn't disturb any evidence and so that they could see in the daylight, which, while I completely agree with their logic, I would question if they left an officer there to watch the crime scene or the scene, because if they didn't, anyone could have come by and changed or disturbed the crime scene or evidence as they pleased, but this wasn't made clear in any of my research. The next morning, as the coroner had arrived on the scene of Lisa's home and was able to examine her remains, as her remains were being moved, there was a strong smell of gasoline, which would alert the authorities that maybe this was not an accident. The crime scene was mainly focused, and the fire as well, in the bathroom itself. The crime scene photos would show charred remains on the floor of a female, face up. In the bathtub was found presumably Lisa's clothing, and the bathtub was filled with water, which I guess isn't uncommon for hurricanes because sometimes the water services get interrupted, so people will fill bathtubs, sinks, or any containers they can for drinking water to be boiled or whatever later on if needed. However, inside of this bathtub that was full of water, there was a dark red tinge to the water that looked as if the bathtub was full of bloody water. Sergeant Mitch McRae, who worked at the time for the Mobile County Sheriff's Office, who seems to be the main authority on this case, along with his captain at the time, Mr. Paul Birch, who were also interviewed on the episode on the Oxygen True Crime Network, they both gave detailed accounts of what this case was like for them. Before the coroner had come out with the cause of death for Lisa's case, Sergeant McRae actually thought that maybe she had some sort of lantern that might have fallen over and lit the bathroom as well as herself on fire. The coroner would actually determine Lisa's cause of death to be bullet holes inside of her skull. This officially made Lisa's case a murder investigation, and now her house was going to be searched for evidence. After the authorities searched Lisa's home, they would find a few peculiar pieces of evidence, including Lisa's phone and cigarettes on the back porch, which to me made me think that she was out there not long before she was killed, because who sits around or does anything without their phone? The authorities also found 2 types of beer cans in the home. Let me explain further. They would find one can upside down in the kitchen sink, and one found in the living room in a koozie on the floor. I have called it a cozy my entire life because I can never fucking remember what the word is, so now it's just a cozy in my mind. Moving on. The reason this stood out to Lisa's family when these were discovered is because Lisa was known to always place a can upside down in the sink when she was finished because she would let all of the fluid drip out of the can. Then she would crush them, keep them in a collection, and she would sell the aluminum cans for money. Did you guys ever do this as a kid? I feel like I have a faint memory of either being with someone who did this once at like King Soopers in Colorado when I was younger, or like being with a friend maybe, like we were out of cigarette money or whatever. Did you guys ever do this when you were younger? I don't remember collecting any cans myself, but I believe I was there reaping the benefits when somebody else did. Good times. Anyway, since Lisa was known for doing this consistently, it left the question of whose beer was left on the floor in the cozy. When it came to Lisa's life, her daughter would explain that their mother would struggle to find a quote-unquote good man to be with. They would explain that their mother would sometimes rush a relationship or move in with them, and when the relationship ended, she wouldn't have a place to stay or live. Amber and Jennifer told their mom finally that she should, stand up on her own 2 feet and get her own place and have a little more stability. Who among us has not done this at one point or another, right? Realized that they needed to do things for themselves and not be dependent on anyone else? We've all been there. Lisa was said to not only have been a loving person, but her daughters describe her as joyous and a good grandmother to her grandkids. Lisa was said to be someone who loved to go to the beach and seemed to enjoy her life as she worked at a local grocery store for the past 20 years. During the initial investigation, one of the first places that the authorities looked for a suspect, of course, was her ex-lovers or suitors that had dated Lisa, which is seemingly a reasonable place to start. According to the authorities on the case, Lisa had actually kept up pretty good relationships with most of her exes. In fact, not only were they pretty upset having heard the news about her death, but all of them also had alibis for the time of her murder. The police, of course, conducted interviews with the neighbors as they were forced to widen the search for Lisa's killer, trying to find out what Lisa may have been up to for the last few days before her death. Mark Bentley, the man who lived next door that Lisa's daughter had run to, and whose family sort of looked out for Lisa, was quite distraught about what had happened to their neighbor, understandably. While questioning Mark, the authorities would inquire about the two men who had also been there as the knock for help came, a man who was known as Scooter and a man who was known as John Paul Chapman, both men working at the time for Mark and staying with him temporarily while doing some debris cleanup for the hurricane damage. Chapman being the one who had stayed behind while the other two men ran for help. A story would start to emerge that seemed a little odd from Scooter about the night the hurricane had hit. The day prior to Ivan hitting their town, Mark, the neighbor, got his family out of the house and to safety at a motel, and when he offered to bring along Chapman and Scooter, they both declined and said they would stay behind to watch his house and keep an eye on it for him. Scooter would then tell authorities that the night of the hurricane, he was looking in Mark's house for batteries and flashlights, and during the search, he would come across Chapman in Mark's bedroom looking in the closet. Chapman told Scooter he had been looking for a radio, but Scooter saw that Chapman had found a pistol instead. According to an article from News 5 WKRG, Chapman had asked Kim Bentley, Mark's wife, where he would be able to find a radio because the hurricane had started hitting the area. Kim would tell Chapman that they had a radio in their closet, but she told Chapman to ask Scooter to get the items out of the closet because apparently Mark and Kim trusted Scooter as they knew him well. Well, instead, Chapman had got into the closet on his own, and this is when he would come across a .25 caliber handgun of the Bentleys that was hidden under some clothing. Scooter would then tell interviewers that he didn't exactly know where Chapman had gone right after that or what he did with the handgun. Later, Scooter would be the one that brought the gun into the authorities as evidence and to run ballistics on. During this time, Mark and Kim would give the authorities some clothing of Chapman's that had been left at the house. I'm assuming here that they did this to run DNA evidence and see if they could find anything, as Chapman had now become a primary suspect. When authorities came looking for Chapman, Mark didn't know where he had gone, but he assumed that he would be back soon, because as far as Mark knew, Chapman was still staying with him and his family, and Scooter at the trailer. The detectives would sloppily find some clothing of Chapman's that seemed to be stained with what authorities assumed was blood. Sergeant McRae would say him and maybe the captain as well, or another officer, would sit at Mark's house on the couch the entire evening waiting for Chapman to come back. As they sat waiting, Mark was able to fill in a little bit about how he met Chapman, saying that he had done some work for Mark a few years before and now after another hurricane had hit. Chapman maybe does the kind of work like the cleanup work, so maybe he has to follow storms in like a nomadic type lifestyle. I'm unsure, but that was kind of the feeling I got from my research. Mark would say over time that he has known Chapman. They became hunting and fishing buddies, and he would stay with Mark and his family during the time that he worked with Mark. That evening and into the next morning, as the authorities sat on Mark's couch, Chapman would never show up. Back at the station, as the authorities ran Chapman's background to see what information there was, they would see that there was a warrant that had been issued for John Paul Chapman in a place called Douglasville, Georgia, and this was for failure to show up to a court hearing. Other than that, the authorities didn't really see anything that stood out as him being a violent assailant or a predator. This is when Chapman would call into the sheriff's station asking what the authorities needed from him and agreeing to come and talk to them, but of course, he was again a no-show. I question here, like, if you're actually going to call in and ask the police why they're looking for you and then make plans to come in and be questioned, you look awfully suspicious just flat out not showing up. At that point, you can't use the excuse of like, oh, I left the area, and then you found out that something was going on and being able to say, I didn't even know the authorities were looking for me. I was done with the work, so I took off to the next place or whatever. You no longer have plausible deniability when you call the police and promise to show. Dumbass. So during the time that Sergeant McRae would say that they were still out looking for Chapman, or at least trying to find him somehow, a call would come into the sheriff's office of an attempted robbery, where it was said a man was running through someone else's home. So as the sheriff's office arrives on the scene of this call, they learn that a man who was allegedly, according to Sergeant McRae, a known meth cook, was speaking to a man in his home. Now, I don't know if this was like a drug selling interaction or what. They didn't really say why this man was in the meth cook's home. Anyways, the cook would witness the man in his home grab what he said was a quote-unquote handful of meth, and then the man proceeded to put it down his pants. In my head, all I could picture was this guy standing there thinking that he was being all casual but completely obvious, who grabs a handful of meth, which I would hope was in like little baggies and not just straight crystal chilling there on the counter. Regardless, after the cook sees this man pocket some of his product, he whipped out a handgun and started chasing the man, but ended up losing him somewhere. The man who fled on foot with a handful of meth down his pants was in fact John Paul Chapman, and because drugs were involved when Chapman took off on foot, he left his vehicle at the cook's house, a red Jeep Cherokee that the authorities seized and then towed. During an interview where Sergeant McRae or maybe Captain Birch were speaking about this particular incident, I was wondering, is it the meth cook himself who called the police? Of course, it probably wasn't, but all I could imagine was this guy calling the authorities yeah, this guy stuffed all of my meth down his pants and then took off. I kind of need my product back, which made me laugh, out loud, because I don't know if you have ever been around somebody who has meth logic, but let's just say that it's a real thing. Don't do drugs. So after this happened, Chapman was still on the run when Captain Birch would receive a phone call himself from a number that was unknown, and on the other line was Chapman. I don't know why this guy keeps calling the authorities who are looking for him, or why he is sticking around the area that he's wanted in, but again, all I can think is drugs make you nuts. So he calls the captain, and as the captain is trying to keep Chapman on the phone in order to trace and pinpoint where this phone call's coming from, Chapman is trying to seemingly convince the captain that he doesn't really know anything. The sheriff's office is then able to find, of course, where the call is coming from, and as they drive up to the spot, they would see a truck parked, and inside was 2 men, the passenger being Chapman. Busted. The driver of the truck, who would be questioned at some point, would tell the authorities that he didn't actually know Chapman, but that this guy came up to his front door asking for a ride to the bus station, and then the driver said, just as a way to get rid of Chapman, he had agreed to drive him. When Chapman was arrested and brought in, he was seemingly high as a kite on meth, with what authorities would describe as a ton of energy and talking really fast. They would also note that on Chapman's face and arms, he had meth sores. Now, many of us already know about meth sores that often show up on people using meth, but all of a sudden I was kind of curious, why does this happen? Before I explain this, I am just going to say here that when I was 16 years old, my older sibling at the time picked me up for a weekend fun time in her hometown, and this would be the first time that I was introduced to methamphetamine and what it does to your body. Long story short, thankfully, I never became an addict, only dabbling in things here and there, but one thing that I definitely remember about meth was I got this huge honking zit on the end of my nose like I had never had before. I had only consumed the drug over a 24-ish hour period, and yet that was enough to give me a Rudolph lookalike, so I can't imagine what this would be like when you partake more often, or worse, are an addict. Okay, that's my tidbit. So I was curious, why do people get meth sores on their face and their limbs when they're using? What causes it scientifically? Because there's got to be something there if so many people have this. Well, I researched a little bit, and according to theaddictioncenter.com, meth scabs or meth mites are both commonly associated with the use of methamphetamines. Meth mites, according to this article, are the quote-unquote bugs that people who are on meth feel that are crawling on them. However, these are not real. This is also not what happened to me. Mine was thankfully just a zit. They are just a sensation that people often feel that there are bugs underneath their skin while they're high. A lot of time, people will pick at their skin or itch it extremely hard to remove the imaginary bugs, which is why you often see various scabs in different stages of healing on an addict. The authorities were able to see these sores on Chapman as they spoke to him. There's also pictures of this as well. When Chapman had been arrested as the officers were taking him to their vehicle, Captain Birch would say during his interview on the Floribama murders episode that Chapman had said, quote, "I had every intention of making you shoot me," end quote. Captain Birch would further comment that while Chapman was being interviewed, at least in the first stages of the investigation, He seemed to believe that he was the smartest person in the room, and then he went on to say that when you have a suspect or a person of interest like that, you kind of have to play along. This makes total sense, and this is that part that blows me away, that the authorities have to interview people who are admitting to heinous crimes, and where they kind of have to just sit back and act like every word coming out of that fucker's mouth doesn't make them want to come across the table, or at least upset them, which I would immediately be fired because I can't control my fucking facial expressions at all sometimes. During the beginning of the interview, Chapman would, of course, deny ever being over at Lisa's house when it came to questions about the night Lisa was murdered. Authorities would comment on how often Chapman would change his story as the questioning continued. While the authorities were able to let him know that he had actually been seen at her house, etc., finally, Chapman would tell Sergeant McCrae and Captain Birch that he had actually gone over to Lisa's house, but it was because she was wanting some meth. He then said the pair had done some drugs together and then proceeded to have sex. Chapman also seemingly bragged on camera during his interview that he had over 20 grams of crystal meth. Remember, that would be 20 large paper clips worth of meth. After this, again, a revolving door of stories that will change with Chapman. He said that Lisa had accidentally overdosed and died. He then said because he was afraid that he would be blamed for her death since he was the one who brought or provided the drugs, instead he decided to run, get a gun, and decided to shoot her so that the cause of death wouldn't look like drugs. Again, meth logic. What in the actual fuck? Even if it's just the story he made up, what sense does it make if he's really trying to sell this story that he didn't want to be blamed for her murder? Then wouldn't it have made more sense for him to just leave the home if Lisa had quote-unquote OD'd? Just left. No one would have known. No one was buying his dumbass story. He then tried to say that after shooting her with the gun, he went and got some gasoline, doused her body in gas, and then lit it on fire. We probably didn't need to be told this, but Captain Birch would say they never had anything indicating that Lisa was ever involved in any type of drugs at all. During this interview, Chapman would borrow one of the cell phones of either the sergeant or the captain to call his girlfriend, Vicky. Unfortunately for Chapman, she didn't answer, and he was taken back to a cell to wait the next step. So this would turn out to be a big mistake on Chapman's part because now the sergeant had the phone number of his girlfriend, and of course he would start calling her to see if they could get some more information about this Chapman guy. Eventually, I believe it was the next morning, Vicky would answer their call. When the sergeant identified himself, Vicky would ask what Chapman was in trouble for, and this is when the sergeant would inform her that they were looking at Chapman for a murder. When all of a sudden, Vicky would say to the sergeant something about, "Oh my God, it was him that did it." She then said to the sergeant she always knew that he was probably the one who had killed her. What? Always knew? This had just happened. So, of course, the sergeant was like, "Wait a minute, what are you talking about?" This is when Vicky would reveal a sinister story relating to Chapman's past. According to Vicky, there was a 16-year-old girl named Amanda Greenwell that had went missing less than a year ago, and when they would find Amanda's remains about a month after she had disappeared, they knew she had been murdered. Vicky then said she always felt like Chapman had something to do with her murder. The day before Amanda Greenwell's remains would be found, Chapman had come home to Vicky's house covered in dirty clothing and all scratched up. And out of character, he would immediately take a shower and wash his clothes. The next day, Amanda's remains were found, and it would be learned that Amanda had been raped, beaten, and suffered a broken neck. And as of now, her case was still unsolved. This would be the first hint into the fact that the authorities could be dealing with a serial killer on their hands. Before interviewers could talk to him about possible other cases, they wanted to get him to admit what he had done to Lisa. This is when Captain Birch would say that he had the idea to make up a little story to see if they could get Chapman to confess to what happened the night of Lisa's murder. Although they had fingerprinted the cozy from Lisa's house with the beer still inside, they didn't come up with anything useful, but Chapman didn't know that. So, Captain Birch had their crime scene unit take a copy of his own fingerprints, and he put them on a card that's usually used from a crime scene when they obtain copies of fingerprints from something. They would then tell Chapman that these prints were from a beer can that was actually inside Lisa's bedroom. Sergeant McCrae said this is when Chapman's demeanor changed to sort of like a quote-unquote "You got me" type attitude. Chapman would then tell the authorities that when he first went over to Lisa's home, she wouldn't let him inside. This is when Chapman would, for whatever reason, start crying to her about his girlfriend Vicky, and it was clear to the sergeant and captain that Chapman was able to turn the tears on and off like a faucet. Chapman then admitted he went over to Lisa's home with the intent of raping her, and according to Floribama Murders, would say to the officers, quote, "She fought like a wildcat, so I killed the bitch," end quote. Oh, this made me so fucking mad. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you expect her to just lie down and take it, you selfish piece of shit? Chapman then admitted he poured gas on Lisa's remains and lit her on fire. Of course, after this confession, Chapman would be arrested and charged with murder. According to News 5, this was the story of events from the evening Lisa was murdered. The morning of September 17th, Chapman and another neighbor were known to have been doing drugs that morning, and that's the same morning that Lisa had left for work for the grocery store at about 5 a.m. That day, Mark Bentley, Scooter, and Chapman all worked on cleaning up the backyard at Mark's home. Later in the evening, Chapman asked Kim Bentley if she would be willing to run and grab him a 6-pack of beer, and she did. But when she got back, she left again with her children. Scooter was then picked up by another man to go help him clean up his backyard as well, leaving Mark and Chapman still doing work and cleaning up debris. Lisa would then get home from work around 5 that evening, and around 6 o'clock, Mark said he was going to run and grab him and Chapman some hamburgers for dinner, but the closest restaurant that was open was about a 30-minute drive from Mark's house. After Lisa's murder, Mark would tell the authorities that since this was the only one that was open at the time, he ended up sitting there in the line for about an hour, which gives about a 2-hour window where Chapman would have been left alone at Mark's house. It was after Mark left Chapman that he would admit that he grabbed the .25 caliber handgun and the beer that Kim had gotten him and headed over to Lisa's house. He then admitted he went into her home, raped Lisa, then proceeded to shoot her 3 times in the head, where it probably goes without saying that sadly she was killed immediately. After he had killed Lisa, Chapman went and grabbed some gasoline, poured it on Lisa's body and around the inside of the bathroom and lit it on fire, which reportedly had caused some sort of an explosion that witnesses would later say they heard that evening around 7 or 8 p.m. Mark would later say that he got back after 8 p.m. at some point. Chapman was getting out of the shower when he got home, and around 10 p.m., Mark, Scooter, and Chapman all headed to bed. Mark would say that he opened his bedroom window that night, and when he did, he heard some noises outside, and he could also smell the smell of gasoline. When he went to investigate, he would find Chapman outside of his window with gas cans. And then, of course, Mark asked, "What are you doing?" Chapman quickly made up an excuse that he was going to fill up a 4-wheeler so that he could go for a quote-unquote ride late at night, and this is when Mark said no and told him to come back inside and go to bed. The authorities were now able to call Lisa's 2 daughters and tell them that they had the murderer in their mother's case. As they were wrapping up Lisa's case somewhat, they wanted to see if Chapman by chance connected to any other crimes. When they went to put in John Paul Chapman's information into a system, and this included his birthday and his social security number, Captain Birch would then say he received a phone call from the Missouri State Prison. This is when they would inform the Mobile County authorities that they had actually had a one Mr. John Paul Chapman in their prison currently with the same social security number and birthday, and that they didn't know who Mobile County had, but that it couldn't be Chapman, as he had been in prison for quite some time for the robbery he had committed. When I heard this part on the Floribama Murders episode, it gave me chills. It's freaky to me when someone's like, I don't know who you've got, but it's not this person. So anyways, the Mobile County authorities needed to figure out who this guy was who had just admitted to killing Lisa Nichols. Well, they turned to this mystery man's girlfriend, Vicky, and asked some more questions. Now, Vicky also knew this man as John Chapman as well, but she did say that she had met his mother before, and that her name was Jenny Beard, and that she lived in Oklahoma. With this new information, Sergeant McRae would reach out to, they said it weird on the episode, it looks like Miami, but it was like, he said it differently, like Miami, or, I don't know, whatever. Miami is what it looks like, Oklahoma authorities, which must be the city or town that she lives in, and gave a little information, and then asked if the name Jenny Beard was familiar to them by chance. This is when the officer on the other end of the line would say, quote, "Tell me you got Jeremy Jones in custody," end quote. They would then tell the sergeant that he was wanted out there in Oklahoma for rape and that they had been searching for Jeremy Jones for quite some time. Within a few minutes, the Oklahoma authorities would fax over a picture of Jeremy Bryan Jones, and of course, this was the man that they knew as Chapman. Now, with his correct name known to them, Sergeant McCrae and Captain Birch would go interview Jeremy and see what else they could dig up from him. Captain Birch would say that when they sat down to interview him, they used his real name, and there was a noticeable change in not only the color of Jeremy's face, but also his demeanor yet again. Jeremy was being served with a multitude of felonies from Oklahoma, and during this interview, he would explain to the authorities how he became John Paul Chapman. Jeremy would say that he was in trouble in Oklahoma and decided, instead of facing his charges like a decent human being, to take off on the run, and during that time, he had landed himself at a bar in Joplin, Missouri, which is way down south in Missouri. It's actually the town that had the gnarly tornado that went through there a while back. As he was at this bar, he had started talking to a woman there who had told Jeremy that her son was in prison, and then offered to sell him her son's Social Security card and driver's license. Mother of the Year award goes to this lady. Holy shit. The best part is that Jeremy only had to pay this lady $50 for his new identity. Her son's identity at that. Wow. Now, with this new identity, Jeremy would move to Georgia, where he would again not be able to keep himself out of trouble, and when he was arrested, he was also fingerprinted there. When his set of fingerprints were sent to the FBI, a fatal mistake was made. For whatever reason, and horrifically, Jeremy's fingerprints were not compared to John Paul Chapman's, and therefore his true identity went unnoticed, which is why he wasn't immediately detained for his string of awful crimes. If this had not happened, lives, at least Lisa, but most likely others as well, could have been saved. So during the interview where the sergeant and captain had his real identity, well, this is when Jeremy would start confessing to crimes that they didn't even know he had done yet. He would admit to having 3 first-degree rapes, a sexual battery charge, some possession charges of marijuana and methamphetamines, and also some paraphernalia charges as well. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't realize that there was different degrees to rape, and I was a little curious, so I did a little research. Turns out, not all states are the same in these rules or laws. Maybe that's why I didn't know, but basically, depending on the age, the incapacitation, the mental condition of the victim, or if they were intoxicated, will determine the different level of rape or sexual assault. I would love to get into these definitions, but since this episode is a little longer already, I'm going to actually save it for another case. However, I will link a website from a law firm that defines these if you're interested like I am. I'm going to try to cover it later, though. After Jeremy had admitted to the other crimes, not only did the FBI send down an officer from their Washington location to help the Mobile County authorities retrace Jeremy Jones's steps and life from the past 25 years, but the Mobile County investigators wanted to try and help connect Jeremy Jones to any case out there that might be unsolved, even if it wasn't inside their own jurisdiction, which I fucking love. Good for them for doing this, and not just being like, well, we can't do anything about it, and leaving it for someone else to hopefully do. During another interview with Jeremy about a murder that they were pretty sure he had already committed in New Orleans, Jeremy would start confessing what had happened during this woman's murder. He would confess that he picked up a sex worker and took her to a warehouse, where he then proceeded to kill her by strangulation. Now, there was a part of the interview shown on Floribama murders that I did not care for, and it bugged me, so I have to share it with you guys. So while the sergeant is interviewing Jeremy about this murder, he says, and I quote, "What did she look like? She had a pretty mouth?" End quote. No offense, Sergeant McCrae, but that's fucking gross and so fucking insulting to a woman who lost her life because of this fucking pig. Shame on you. Then Jeremy said, yeah, and this woman also had bleached blonde hair, and he believed her to be somewhere between 18 and 21 years old. He then proceeded to call her a crackhead, as if being a crackhead means that she's not important or a human being. This woman's name was Catherine Collins, and when the Mobile authorities reported this to New Orleans, they would confirm this as being a true case. This is 3 different murders in 3 different states that Jeremy is being looked at as having committed. The trial for Jeremy went as expected, and the jury didn't take long to come back with a guilty verdict, where Jeremy Jones was then handed a death penalty sentence. Since this time, Jeremy Jones has now admitted to killing 13 different people, at least, in 5 different states, according to multiple sources, including an article from the News 6 out of Oklahoma. Jeremy admitted to a murder way back in 1992 of Jennifer Judd in Baxter Springs, Kansas, which he would say he stabbed her to death. Then, in 1996, Jeremy would admit to killing Daniel Oakley and a woman named Doris Harris by shooting them both in Delaware County. He then went on to admit to drugging a man from Oklahoma in 1999 named Justin Hutchins. Just 3 months after the death of Justin, Jeremy would admit to shooting and killing 2 more people named Danny and Kathy Freeman, again in Oklahoma, this time in Welch. 2 more people he had admitted to killing, and this one comes up a lot when you research this monster, is the killings of 2 girls named Ashley Freeman and Laura Bible, to which he said he then dumped their bodies somewhere in Kansas after murdering them. Jeremy then said he moved to Georgia, where in 2002 he would stab a woman to death named Tina Mayberry, and this murder was followed by the murder in New Orleans of Catherine Collins. Just a few short months after this, he admitted to the killing of 16-year-old Amanda Greenwell in Georgia, and this was the murder that his girlfriend Vicky had suspected him of already. A month after this, Jeremy admitted to another murder of a woman named Patrice Edris, again in Georgia, and then, of course, we know he murdered Lisa Nichols in Alabama. So, with Jeremy Jones being such a pathological liar, there is, of course, some questioning to whether or not he really committed these murders. But one thing that the authorities are able to prove is that he had lived in each and every one of these areas when these murders took place. Back in 2005, the authorities searched some mines in Kansas for the remains of Freeman and Bible, the 2 girls, and also a pond in Chickasaw for the remains of some sex workers, to no avail. However, that doesn't mean for 1 second that he isn't telling the truth. I mean, couldn't it be as easy as they just couldn't find the remains, or that the places aren't accurate? I mean, he is an ex-meth user, let's not forget that. Fucking drugs fry your brain. One source would say that, for example, on December 30th, 1999, victims Danny and Kathy Freeman are found shot to death in their home in Oklahoma, and then their daughter named Ashley Freeman and her friend Laura Bible, both girls being 16, disappeared, and that eventually Jeremy would admit to killing all 4 of these people. I don't think it's a far stretch to believe him because we know for a fact that he killed Amanda Greenwell and she was also 16. Jeremy Bryan Jones seems to be a sadistic murderer and rapist whose method of killing was mainly stabbing or shooting, and his crimes spanned over a 12-year period. Many authorities still believe that there either remains to be found of his victims or that there even could be other crimes that he hasn't admitted to because this chicken shit is known to have not been willing to admit to his mother or girlfriend, at least at the time his girlfriend, of his crimes, but continues to insist that they are all factual and accurate to the authorities. As of 2023, Jeremy Bryan Jones is still awaiting his execution date, and I think I can speak for us all when I say the world will be a better place once this turd is gone. And that, my friends, is the story of Jeremy Bryan Jones, serial rapist, predator, serial killer, and fucking nutbag. This fucking guy, am I right? So I've said this before and I'm going to say it again for people just like recently joined us, but I script these episodes out as I'm learning and researching so that my reactions can be in real time and we can learn the cases and stories together. And this motherfucker, I had no idea how wide his net would be or how much there was going to be about him, to be honest. There's a lot of information out there on him and some of his other crimes that is super interesting. I believe that there is one book, at least, as well. I have a running list in a few different places of either cases that people suggest or things or people that I hear about and I might want to cover in the future. And his name was on the list. And Sunday night, as I usually do, I was looking up his name and a little bit about him. And all I saw was the information about Lisa Nichols, like her charred remains in this case. And I was just like, holy shit. I was thinking not only does it take a special kind of person to rape and kill a human being, but also that added element of setting their remains on fire. I don't know what it is, but it's just so freaky to me and so fucking upsetting. I feel so sorry for her daughters and grandchildren who went through this, and for all of his victims' loved ones and families who've been affected by this fucking scumbag. I think he deserves every bit of the death penalty that's coming to him, and I'm also glad that he's had to sit there and rot on death row for so long. I tried to find out if he's been executed yet, but the most recent update that I could find was 2023, so if anyone knows anything further about him or wants to share, please do on the TheKillFile socials. We love getting a good conversation going about this case because obviously I get real invested in these and I feel like I get to know a lot about these victims and families, and I want them to get the justice they deserve. Well, I hope to see you guys come on back next Monday for another case here on the TheKillFile where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the TheKillFile and other true crime lovers find us. Also, check out the website at TheKillFile.com to suggest a case. Find our merch shop for fun TheKillFile gear, which you can also find at thekillfile.printify.me and help support the podcast. Have a suggestion or want to share your own true crime stories? Email thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com for a chance to get them read on the podcast. Follow The TheKillFile on your favorite social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue X, TikTok, and of course, you can subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. We are either listed as The TheKillFile or The TheKillFile Podcast. Come on back Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case here on The TheKillFile, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.